Security, please escort this woman from the executive lobby. She clearly doesn't belong here. The command sliced through Solovek's Global Partners' marble expanse, cutting through the choreographed morning silence with surgical precision. Where are you watching from? Some stories unfold in boardrooms, but they echo in every corner of the world. Glass and steel framed not merely a lobby but a cathedral of influence, a sanctuary where belonging was predetermined by unspoken codes authored long before any visitor arrived. Camille Rhodes didn't move. In her slate gray blazer with impeccable tailoring, portfolio clutched like armor against her chest, she stood immovable. Not loud. Not disruptive. Not lost. Simply present, her very existence a disruption to their carefully calibrated ecosystem of power. No one asked her name. Behind her, a white man in navy wool sailed through security without credentials. The receptionist beamed with instinctive recognition, ushering him forward with a conspiratorial smile that said, "You belong here." 3 others had entered in the past 5 minutes, all nodded through with cursory glances at badges half hidden behind designer lapels. Camille Rhodes was not here to pitch. She was here to evaluate Solovek's eligibility for a federal infrastructure contract under executive oversight. She wasn't asking for access. She was granting consideration. The distinction was profound and entirely lost on everyone who had encountered her since she entered the building 14 minutes ago. Camille, a federal evaluator and CEO in her own right, was still mistaken for anything but someone with decision-making power. Not because of her conduct, because of her complexion. The calculation had been made before she'd spoken a single word, her worth diminished by assumptions as old as the country itself. They whispered about her appearance, her natural hair, her sensible heels, the cut of her blazer that spoke of quality without ostentation. They judged as she waited, her composure a silent challenge to their assumptions about who commanded rooms and who merely served in them. But this time, she hadn't come to ask for permission. She'd come to make assessments of her own. The NextBridge federal initiative represented the largest infrastructure investment in 3 decades, $80 billion flowing through channels that would reshape American communities for generations. Camille wasn't merely conducting a routine evaluation, she was determining who would steward resources that could transform neglected neighborhoods or perpetuate their isolation. Power didn't reside in the marble beneath her feet. It lived in the portfolio she carried. Behind reception sat Chloe Adams, applying a fresh coat of lipstick without bothering to look up at the approaching visitor. Her reflection captured her full attention, the compact mirror angled to showcase her newly highlighted hair. Yes. Her tone dismissive before seeing who stood before her, the question itself suggesting an intrusion rather than scheduled business. Good morning. Appointment with Mr. Denton, 10 a.m. Camille Rhodes. Each syllable measured, professional, neither apologetic nor confrontational. Chloe looked up, surprise flashing across her face before a practiced mask of professional detachment slid into place. "One moment," she replied, the words clipped. As her manicured nails tapped across keys, an intern in an ill-fitting suit leaned casually against the counter behind her. He snickered just loudly enough to ensure his comment would reach its intended target. "Didn't know we had a community initiative scheduled today." The word community twisted into something vaguely patronizing, charitable work rather than serious business. Camille heard. Her expression remained unchanged, but her fingers tightened imperceptibly around her portfolio, not in anxiety but in recognition of a familiar pattern. She'd encountered this particular choreography of diminishment in boardrooms from Boston to San Francisco. The steps never varied, only the dancers changed. Chloe stared at the monitor with theatrical confusion, brows furrowed as though deciphering ancient text. "Mr. Denton." "The CEO." The emphasis suggested an impossibility, a scheduling error rather than a legitimate appointment. "Yes," Camille replied, voice steady, offering no elaboration that might suggest defensiveness. Confirmation. The question emerged with an undercurrent of suspicion. Camille presented Solovex's watermarked letter, sliding it forward with deliberate precision across the pristine countertop evidence that couldn't be dismissed with raised eyebrows or pointed questions. Chloe examined it with exaggerated care, seeking flaws or inconsistencies that might justify further delay. Finding none, she summoned the elevator with obvious reluctance, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "He'll be with you shortly." No coffee offered. No seat suggested. None of the courtesies that would have been extended automatically to others deemed worthy of the executive suite. Camille moved toward the waiting area, selecting a chair with sightlines to both the elevator bank and reception. She sat down, opened her tablet, and calmly reviewed her materials, not out of uncertainty but from the disciplined preparation that had characterized her entire career. Her breathing remained steady, though she'd navigated this familiar theater 100 times before in different buildings with different names engraved on different marble walls. She wasn't just prepared. She was overqualified for a conversation they weren't ready to have. 10 minutes passed beyond her scheduled appointment time. No message. No acknowledgement. Camille stood and returned to reception, positioning herself directly in Chloe's sightline, making avoidance impossible without obvious rudeness. "Has Mr. Denton been informed of my arrival?" Her question precise, neither accusatory nor pleading, simply seeking information she had every right to request. Chloe's lips tightened momentarily before she reached for the phone, dialing with exaggerated slowness, each number pressed with theatrical deliberation. "Yes, Camille Rhodes here. Claims to have an appointment with Mr. Denton." A pause. "Amicham." The subtle emphasis on "claims" hung in the air between them. She replaced the receiver without looking up. "He'll be down." 3 minutes later, the elevator chimed its arrival. Harold Denton emerged, Italian suit and practiced smile, the kind that creased the corners of his eyes without quite reaching them. "Ms. Rhodes. I wasn't told you were here." The words themselves an apology, the tone suggesting a misunderstanding rather than a calculated delay. Their handshake was brief but firm, Camille matching his pressure exactly, neither dominating nor submitting to the ritual exchange of power disguised as courtesy. She allowed herself a brief glance at Chloe, whose attention was suddenly consumed by reorganizing items on her desk. "I'm accustomed to being overlooked," Camille replied, her voice pleasant but direct, an observation rather than a complaint. Color rose in Chloe's cheeks, spreading from her throat upward in a visible manifestation of discomfort. The elevator ride proceeded in silence, Denton checking his phone twice in the 43 seconds it took to reach the executive floor. When the doors opened, he gestured vaguely down the corridor. "Samantha will get you settled. I need to check on something before we begin." A practiced exit, leaving her with his subordinate. Samantha Trent waited, arms crossed, her handshake when it came deliberately limp, a subtle refusal to acknowledge Camille as an equal. Her designer glasses slid down her nose as she looked Camille over with thinly veiled contempt, taking in her sensible heels and practical portfolio with a dismissive glance. "We're using an alternate room today," Samantha said, leading Camille away from the executive corridor with brisk steps that suggested impatience. She checked her watch twice in the short walk, as though calculating the minimum time required for professional courtesy before she could return to more important matters. The meeting room was more of a utility space, clearly a calculated downgrade, deliberate optics to unsettle. But Camille had outgrown needing polished tables to prove she belonged at them. She noted the dust on the window ledge, the flickering fluorescent light, the chairs that didn't quite match, all designed to communicate her place in their hierarchy without saying a word. "I'll let them know you're ready," Samantha said, closing the door with a finality that suggested it might not reopen. Camille placed her materials in the center of the chipped table, aligned her tablet with the edge, and checked her watch. She didn't fidget or pace. She simply waited, her stillness itself a form of control they couldn't diminish. 20 minutes passed. No Denton. No executive team. No acknowledgement. She gathered her things with methodical precision and left the room, navigating directly to the executive suite with the confidence of someone who had memorized the floor plan before arrival, a necessary preparation for precisely this scenario. This wasn't her first strategic retreat, it was an advance by another route. Through glass walls, she spotted a full meeting in progress. Denton sat at the head of the table, engaged in what appeared to be a substantive presentation. Bryce Langford, the CFO, nodded along, making notes. Samantha sat 3 chairs down, apparently having delivered Camille to isolation and returned to actual business. Camille knocked once on the glass door and entered without waiting for permission or invitation. The conversation halted abruptly. 8 faces turned toward her, expressions ranging from surprise to irritation at the interruption. "Ms. Rhodes," Denton stammered, surprise breaking his carefully cultivated composure. "We were just about to send for you." "I've been waiting 37 minutes, Camille said, her voice measured but carrying to every corner of the room. "Ms. Trent directed me to an incorrect location." Samantha shifted in her seat, suddenly fascinated by her notes, a flush creeping up her neck. Before anyone could respond, Chloe appeared at the doorway, slightly breathless, clutching a security tablet with white-knuckled urgency. "Excuse me for the interruption. Security needs to re-verify this guest's credentials immediately. There appears to be a system irregularity." Camille turned slowly, letting silence build before speaking, a pause that charged the air with tension. "Irregularity? You verified my clearance 20 minutes ago at reception." With deliberate movements that commanded attention, she withdrew the same immaculate document from her portfolio and placed it precisely at the center of the glossy conference table, her hand lingering deliberately on the paper, a gesture of ownership over the moment. In case paper carries more weight than presence in these halls. Denton frowned, glancing between Camille and his flustered receptionist. "Chloe, that's enough. Ms. Rhodes is my invited guest." Chloe retreated from the doorway, but not before shooting Samantha a glance that spoke volumes about shared tactics. Interrupted. The loaded silence in the room lingered like a physical presence. Camille took a seat at the table without being invited to do so, her movements unhurried but decisive. She sat tall, gaze steady, shoulders squared. She didn't blink, her focus tracking every glance exchanged, every whispered aside, every micro-expression that revealed the room's collective assessment of her worth. And still she didn't flinch or waver, a testament to years of navigating spaces designed to exclude her very existence. She connected her tablet to the presentation system with practiced efficiency. Her opening slide materialized on the main display, NextBridge Federal Co-Investment Initiative. Blue and gold colors announced federal authority without requiring words, a visual language of power that those with discernment would immediately recognize. NextBridge represents $80 billion in infrastructure development across 16 states, she began, voice carrying authority without straining for it. Our federal oversight ensures partnerships require both technical capability and institutional character. We aren't simply building roads and bridges. We're building legacies that will outlast everyone in this room. Bryce Langford shifted forward in his chair, his gold cufflinks catching the light as he adjusted his posture. His fingers drummed once on the leather portfolio before him, a gesture of impatience rather than interest. "Do you hold an MBA?" he interrupted, his tone suggesting the question was a trap, his smile never reaching eyes that had dismissed countless others before her. Camille let silence stretch for 3 seconds, holding his gaze without blinking, a deliberate pause that established control of the conversation's rhythm. "Dual masters. Environmental systems and financial engineering. Princeton." She didn't elaborate further, making him ask if he wanted more, forcing him to acknowledge his interest or retreat. "Not business administration, then," he said, smile tight. "Interesting choice for this sector." The words hung in the air, the implication clear: you lack appropriate credentials. You don't belong in this discussion. Our technical foundation supports our projections of 22% ROI across diversified regional investments, she continued, not acknowledging his dismissal as though it hadn't occurred. "As detailed in Section 3 of your packets." Thomas Mercer, lean and predatory in his tailored gray suit, leaned toward Bryce, whispering just loudly enough to ensure she would hear, "How did this get scheduled directly with Harold? Bypassed all the normal channels. Who backs this initiative?" Bryce interrupted again, leaning forward with an elbow on the table. "Partners we might recognize. Strategic alignment with multiple state agencies and federal oversight committees. Full documentation provided in your compliance packet," Camille replied, gesturing to the folder he hadn't bothered to open. He flipped through pages with obvious disinterest, barely scanning the content before allowing them to fall closed again. The performance of consideration without its substance. Just then, the projection system flickered and went dark mid-slide. "Another session scheduled for this room," the coordinator announced from the doorway without meeting Camille's eyes. Camille glanced pointedly at the wall clock, 11:22. "Room reserved until 11:30. "New orders from scheduling," came the reply, without further explanation. Bryce Langford stood abruptly, straightening his jacket with a tug that showcased his monogrammed cuffs. "I believe we've seen enough of this diversity leadership exercise." The words hung in the air, a challenge disguised as dismissal, the assumption that her presence was merely symbolic rather than substantive, a box checked rather than a voice that mattered. Camille began gathering her materials with deliberate care. As she rose from her seat, Bryce stepped closer than necessary, invading her personal space with practiced intimidation. "Not every table is built for everyone, is it?" The words emerged soft enough to avoid being overheard by others, but sharp enough to draw blood. She held his gaze until he looked away, first a subtle victory unnoticed by others in the room but deeply felt by both participants. "Some tables," she replied quietly, "are built to be replaced." In the investor lounge adjacent to the main conference space, Camille was offered a glass of lukewarm water in a flimsy paper cup. Around her, executives sipped espresso from fine china, engaged in conversation that fell silent as she approached. She sat alone in a chair slightly lower than the others, observing interactions around her with calculated attention, gathering intelligence that would prove useful sooner than anyone in the room might imagine. Thomas Mercer approached from across the marble expanse, authority in his stance, his movements suggesting ownership of the space and everyone in it. "This area is reserved for investors and board members," he announced without preamble or introduction. "Need help finding your department? Perhaps HR?" "Mr. Denton invited me personally," Camille replied, not moving from her seat, her posture relaxed but grounded. "Ah." His eyes flicked over her badge with exaggerated attention. "We've had access issues lately. Security concerns." "Clearly," she replied, a hint of steel beneath the single word that made him blink. He retreated to where Samantha stood by the window, their heads inclined toward each other in conspiratorial proximity. Across the expanse of polished marble, fragments of their conversation carried to where Camille sat, their voices louder than they realized. "Still here?" "Thought this was merely a courtesy pitch," Thomas murmured, swirling amber liquid in a crystal tumbler. "These types always push boundaries," Samantha replied, tapping her Mont Blanc pen against her portfolio with rhythmic impatience. "Always trying to leverage diversity initiatives for access they haven't earned. Expecting special treatment. Exhausting," Thomas agreed. "Next they'll want their own parking spaces. Camille appeared beside them, so suddenly both startled, neither having noticed her approach across the plush carpet. Their expressions shifted from surprise to embarrassment, not at what they'd said, but at being overheard saying it. "My boundaries?" she asked softly, her voice carrying just far enough to reach them without broadcasting to the entire room. "Check next quarter's federal impact funding ledger. Under denied applications." She left without waiting for a response, each step deliberate, her decision crystallizing with every footfall. This wasn't merely about one meeting or one company. This was about systems that needed dismantling and rebuilding with new blueprints. The following morning, she returned to Solovex Global Partners. The same security guard who had questioned her credentials yesterday now straightened as she approached, his demeanor transformed. Her visitor badge now read, Federal Liaison Strategic Oversight. Chloe froze mid-greeting at the reception desk, recognition dawning with horror as she realized what this change signified. William Chen, Chief Legal Officer, stepped forward with newfound urgency, intercepting Camille before she reached the elevators. "Ms. Rhodes. The board is waiting upstairs," he said, anxiety threading through his professional composure. "Full attendance, as requested." On floor 61, the sanctum sanctorum of Solovex Power, Denton and the full executive team sat in uneasy silence around the gleaming conference table. No one scrolled through phones. No side conversations murmured in corners. Just the weighted silence of people suddenly aware they were being evaluated. Camille placed 2 sealed envelopes on the table with deliberate precision, allowing them to land with audible finality against the polished wood. "This confirms my federal appointment and oversight authority," she explained, her voice carrying the weight of institutional power. "This contains your preliminary compliance review findings for the infrastructure contract consideration." She let silence work where words would diminish impact. The room remained motionless, waiting. Yesterday, a fiscal verification document from my presentation packet was deliberately destroyed. We recovered fragments with federal watermarking near your print center. No movement. No sound. Just the weight of realization spreading across faces as the implications became clear. "This isn't punishment," she said, each word precisely weighted. "It's an assessment of institutional fitness for executive accountability. The infrastructure projects under consideration require partners who demonstrate integrity at every level." Denton cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "You didn't need to deliver this assessment personally. I wanted you to see what you missed when you chose to see my skin instead of my credentials." Her voice remained measured, neither raised in anger nor hushed in deference. "Yesterday was an evaluation. You failed it." Bryce leaned forward, color rising from his collar, spreading across his face in mottled patches. "You can't possibly have the authority to." Camille slid a third document across the table with a single finger, its gold seal catching the light. "Federal Oversight Commission authorization, signed yesterday following my report." Bryce fell silent mid-sentence, eyes widening as he scanned the signatures of 3 cabinet secretaries and the distinctive presidential letterhead. She stood straighter, her presence suddenly filling the cavernous room. "You didn't dismiss a woman. You dismissed a federally empowered oversight officer. And with that, Solovex is formally removed from all current and pending infrastructure award cycles." Thomas half rose from his chair, palms flat against the table. "This is absurd. One misplaced document doesn't invalidate an entire corporate evaluation. We can appeal this immediately." "It wasn't misplaced," Camille interrupted, her voice eerily calm. "It was shredded. After I was deliberately isolated in a storage room. After Mr. Langford's comments about tables not built for everyone." She produced photographs of the recovered document fragments, each marked with federal tracking codes. Everything was documented. Everything was witnessed. Samantha's pen clattered to the floor. No one moved to retrieve it. This company's structural approach to diverse voices reflects how you would handle community input on critical infrastructure projects. Your internal culture predicts your external impact. We need partners capable of seeing value in perspectives different from their own. She gathered her materials with unhurried movements. That clearly isn't Solovex. The consequences unfolded with merciless efficiency in the weeks that followed. Solovex was removed from consideration for all federal infrastructure contracts. Billions in potential revenue evaporated overnight. Bryce was suspended pending internal investigation. Samantha reassigned to regional operations in Montana. Chloe's employment terminated without reference. An internal memo circulated simply throughout the organization. Not a failure of capability. A failure of character. 3 weeks later, Camille led a high-level meeting with newly selected partners at federal headquarters. Her tablet displayed a revised presentation. Next bridge, equitable infrastructure and the culture of respect. The room held representatives from 12 companies, all vetted not merely for technical capability but for demonstrated commitment to equity in practice, not just policy. Around the table sat faces diverse in every sense: age, ethnicity, background, unified by competence rather than conformity. A notification flashed on her tablet: urgent appeal from Solovex legal counsel. She dismissed it with a single tap, not breaking her sentence. A junior associate leaned close during a momentary pause. "That was bold, what you did with Solovex." "Not bold," Camille replied, eyes on her notes. "Merely overdue." She surveyed the room, diverse, focused, capable of seeing beyond their own reflections. "Let's begin our diversity leadership initiative with substance, not symbolism. Infrastructure isn't just about what we build, but who builds it, and who benefits from its completion. Because real power doesn't shout. It walks in. Prepared. And makes silence itself a statement. The dismissed become decision makers. The overlooked become overseers. Those who mistake appearance for ability learn that authority isn't claimed through inheritance or entitlement, it's earned through character that transcends superficial judgments." As Camille initiated America's infrastructure transformation, she thought of every woman who had stood where she stood without institutional leverage to demand justice. Her victory belonged to each one silenced in meetings, relegated to storage rooms, or asked if she was lost when she knew exactly where she belonged. This wasn't just about one woman or one company or one federal contract. This was about executive accountability in a system that too often rewarded the wrong metrics, that confused confidence for competence and tradition for merit. Next bridge would build more than physical connections across geographic divides, it would bridge chasms separating potential from opportunity. With companies that understood respect wasn't optional or performative but foundational to the federal oversight process and essential to meaningful community engagement. Camille felt the table's solidity beneath her fingertips, aware that her presence at its head represented more than personal achievement. In boardrooms everywhere, similar scenes unfolded daily, but today, in this room, the outcome had been different. Not because she'd raised her voice, but because she'd refused to make herself small for others' comfort. Our first priority: redefining infrastructure for modern America. The next slide showed networks of physical structures and human potential flowing through communities traditionally excluded from prosperity and planning. Infrastructure isn't merely concrete and steel. It's connecting talent to opportunity without artificial barriers. It's ensuring that bridges don't just span rivers but historical divides. Around the table, heads nodded in understanding. This wasn't just a government contract, it was reshaping possibility itself. Built by those who understood that excellence transcends demographics and that diverse perspectives yield stronger solutions. As the meeting progressed, Camille experienced something that should have been commonplace but remained rare: the freedom to focus on work rather than constantly defending her right to be present. In that freedom lay her deepest victory, excellence without perpetual self-justification. Afternoon light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating faces focused on building something lasting. Outside, a city moved through its rhythms, unaware that here, in this room, a quiet revolution unfolded: the profound power of competence recognized on its own terms, without qualification or asterisks. Camille allowed herself one brief moment of satisfaction, not for retribution delivered, but for power redirected toward those who would wield it with both competence and conscience. Because the most revolutionary act isn't speaking truth to power. It's becoming the power that speaks truth. And creating spaces where others need not fight to be seen. 2 years later, Nextbridge broke ground on its 100th infrastructure contract project. Cameras flashed as Camille stood at the podium, sunlight catching silver threads in her hair that hadn't been there when the initiative began. Behind her, a diverse team of engineers, architects, community organizers, and government officials waited to speak. The banner unfurled in the morning breeze, building bridges, breaking barriers. A reporter called from the press section, "Is this your legacy, Ms. Rhodes?" Camille smiled, her gaze sweeping across faces that reflected America in its fullness rather than its fragments. "This isn't just my legacy. It's a blueprint for every Black CEO, every overlooked leader, every professional forced to outperform just to be perceived as equal. And now, we're no longer asking for seats. We're redesigning the table." As she stepped away from the microphone, moving through the crowd toward the ceremonial first shovel, she passed a familiar face. Chloe Adams stood at the periphery, older now, less polished, watching the proceedings with complex emotions playing across her features. Their eyes met briefly in silent recognition. Chloe looked away first. Some lessons in executive accountability came at greater cost than others. Some transformations required loss before growth could begin. In that silent acknowledgement between two women whose paths had crossed at the precise moment for transformation, Camille recognized that change happened not in grand declarations or policies but in quiet moments of recognition, in the subtle shifts of who speaks and who listens, who leads and who follows, who belongs without question and who must constantly prove their worth. From across the gathering, she spotted Bryce Langford watching from the periphery, his former power diminished to spectator status. He had resurfaced at a smaller firm, his career trajectory permanently altered by the Solivex incident, now a case study in leadership programs across the country. Thomas Mercer had left the industry entirely, his expertise suddenly devalued in a marketplace that had begun demanding more than technical knowledge. His LinkedIn profile now listed him as an independent consultant. Samantha Trent had written an article for a business journal about learning experiences and evolving corporate cultures that never once mentioned Camille by name. Erasure as the final refuge of the diminished. Nextbridge would reshape American infrastructure for generations. Highways would connect formerly isolated communities to economic opportunity. Broadband networks would bridge digital divides. Water systems would replace poisoned pipes. Power grids would reach neighborhoods long neglected. But its most profound impact would remain invisible to engineers and architects, the subtle shift in who had power to build, to decide, to approve, to belong without justification or exception. The true infrastructure Camille helped build wasn't measured in steel or stone. It was measured in who felt seen, who felt heard, and who never had to justify their right to be in the room again. If you've ever been underestimated, this story is for you. The quiet ones aren't weak, they're taking notes. And sometimes, they're signing the checks.